Welcome to the Vantage Fit Corporate Wellness Podcast. This podcast is sponsored by Vantage Fit, the all-in-one AI-powered corporate wellness platform developed by Vantage Circle.
Working remotely often means long hours spent alone at home or in a home office. The absence of daily face-to-face interactions with colleagues can lead to feelings of isolation and loneliness. Remote workers miss out on the casual conversations, coffee breaks, and camaraderie that come naturally in a traditional office setting. These interactions, though seemingly minor, play a crucial role in fostering a sense of belonging. Hello and welcome to another episode of Vantage Fit Corporate Wellness Podcast. I'm your host Dipshi, and today I have with me the Director of Workforce Transformation and Chief Brand Storyteller at Hubstaff, William Sipling. With over 13 years of experience in communications, media, and leadership, William focuses interest on labor relations, inclusive HR practices, and organizational development. He holds a bachelor's degree in psychology, 2 master's degrees in humanities, and is a doctoral student in business administration. Welcome to the show, William.
Thanks so much for having me on. I appreciate it.
So, William, before diving into today's topic, would you like to introduce yourselves to our listeners and also tell us about your wellness journey?
Yeah, sounds great. Again, thank you so much for having me on. As mentioned, my name is William, and I work at a fun intersection of HR, employee experience, marketing and communication, as well as software, working at Hubstaff, which is a workforce analytics and employee experience software platform. Now, what I really enjoy talking about is helping people have their best day at work, which of course overlaps with wellness. Personally, I used to be something of a workaholic, and now I understand what it means to have a better work-life balance. And that leads to psychological and physical benefits outside of work and when I'm clocked in. So I'm a big believer in workplace wellness.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing your journey with us, William. So let's start with the first question. So how has the widespread adoption of remote work during the public health crisis affected employees' feelings of loneliness and isolation?
Yeah, what's interesting is when the pandemic became sort of a widespread pandemic, that was only a few years ago. We're thinking about 2019 numbers. So what we haven't been able to do yet is totally separate the numbers on responses to surveys about loneliness from the kind of overarching topsy-turvy world of COVID to loneliness in general. Now, what's interesting is that there are some numbers that we can look at that will help us try to understand what's gone on between these two things. There was a 2022 survey in the Environmental Health and Preventative Medicine publication that showed that workers were a little bit marginally more likely to report feeling lonely compared to those who did not work remotely in terms of being in the office. So what's interesting is those who work remotely and those who didn't work remotely, there was only some slight differences in those measurements. Now, again, we do have to kind of keep in mind that during the pandemic and lockdowns and social isolation, it's hard to separate those two numbers together. Now, we are in 2023, a little bit removed. So perhaps there will be some new numbers coming out that will try to, draw a distinction between those two things. And some surveys kind of say one side or the other. But we can understand that loneliness and isolation in general are no good for feelings of mental and physical health. One thing that's you've mentioned as well from the top of the show here is that there are conversations like the water cooler conversations or the lunchroom conversations that we would understand could be a healthy sort of bringing people together in the workplace, while at the same time realizing that some of those office environments didn't always work great for everyone. For introverts in particular, those lunchroom conversations could be the kind of things that they were dreading. And when working from home, it could be that introverts in particular could enjoy being able to stagger those Zoom or Google Meet conversations with the lunch times that they might take on their own. Or they might choose to have lunch with a close friend outside of work, that they'll have more flexibility because they're not in the office to take those on their own, and therefore not be able to kind of use up that finite resource of needing to interact with others socially. So there aren't surveys that make a clear distinction between what was working, what's not working, between remote work and traditional in-office settings. But we can say, in general, obviously, loneliness is not a good thing for folks. And anything that can be done in the office and working remotely or in hybrid settings to combat loneliness, the better.
Mm-hmm. I also believe so. When we are working remotely or working from home, our interaction gets very limited, right? So all we do is talk to our family members and friends probably, but we do not talk or communicate that much with our team members or whoever is it we're working with, right? So I believe that's one of the biggest drawbacks of remote work, right? And tell me some of the common signs and symptoms of loneliness that remote workers may experience, and how can they be addressed?
Yeah, some of the more telltale signs would be what we would consider a lack of employee engagement. So employee engagement can be measured on several different levels. The way that I like to measure engagement that seems to have some less noise involved is a decrease in outputs or completed projects. Now, there are lots of different factors that go into a decrease in outputs or completed projects, but employee engagement tends to be one of the top ones. And of course, employee engagement is affected by feelings of isolation and loneliness. One of the things that's important to do to keep an eye on employee engagement is to have regular check-ins with one's team members, and to also have the ability to have transparency into projects being worked on and projects completed. So during one-on-ones, it's important for managers to ask questions about burnout, feelings of isolation, feelings of connectivity and inclusiveness, and then as well to be able to check in on projects that are either late, delayed, or missing pieces that are required. The reason why I think it's important to look at outputs and not other measures like vanity metrics is because as long as you're hiring great workers who enjoy getting things done, you'll have an intrinsic motivation from workers who want to accomplish their goals and put in a good day's work. Now, if those kinds of workers are starting to slip a little bit, that's probably not going to be a measure of, laziness or things like that. It's more likely a measure of a lack of engagement. And that lack of engagement can be affected by a few things. For one, it can be a sign that managers need to develop some intentional methods of inclusion. By intentional, I don't just mean ask people to chat on Slack more, which is not a bad thing, but it isn't super goal-oriented. Intentional things that will increase inclusivity and involvement might be incentivizing particular types of behaviors in the workplace. At Hubstaff, we have a Hubstars channel in Slack, where we encourage team members to shout out each other on the basis of putting out some great work, putting out fires, stepping in if another team member needed coverage. We also encourage people to share their favorite articles that we post or talk about on their personal LinkedIn pages. And when they do that, we love shouting them out as well. We encourage folks to get together as much as they can in real life. And we also encourage folks to meet up with each other in an annual retreat. So when I say intentional, those are the kinds of things that I'm talking about, as well as those kind of standard best practices like those one-on-ones with managers and employees.
Mm-hmm. And are there differences in the experience of loneliness between employees who have always worked remotely and those who transitioned to remote work due to the pandemic?
Yeah, there's an interesting article that came out in February 2022 in the Human Resource Management Journal. It's called Surviving Remotely: How Job Control and Loneliness During a Forced Shift to Remote Work Impacted Employee Work Behaviors and Well-Being. It's a bit of a mouthful, but I'm sure you can type in some of those keywords to look that up. There was an interesting finding that said that high job control may have reduced the likelihood that an employee would feel constrained by permissions and expectations found in some of the survey questions. So what we can see from that is the differences between somebody who was maybe working in an office or not before the pandemic and then being forced to work remotely in the pandemic seem to be based on one's ability to control the kind of work that they did. So for instance, we might say that a knowledge worker who had a lot of control over their job, maybe they're going out and talking to clients, or they have a relatively flexible schedule before the pandemic, or they weren't really being micromanaged. It's very likely that the survey data seems to indicate to us that those folks weren't very negatively affected by the shift to remote work. Now, folks that had more control, or I guess you could say less control, where they had more managerial or cultural control. So you might see like a customer service representative. It seems that those folks might have become less happy and less engaged by the shift to fully remote work or isolation. We might imagine that some of the reasons for that could be a less of an understanding of expectations, right? For customer service representatives who are working in a call center or in an office, it was very easy to kind of feel the general vibes of having lots of coworkers around you, having conversations, talking, being on the phone during those business hours to take those customer calls. Now imagine the shift that happens for those kind of less controlled jobs when now you're sitting at home. Now, you're supposed to be on the phones and talking to folks, but there's nobody around you doing that. So when there's a little less control, when there's a little less structure, there does tend to be feelings of less engagement, potentially connected to loneliness and less interactions for those jobs. So I think that would tell us that for managers who are managing folks in those more structured environments, there needs to be, as I mentioned before, more intentionality on getting those folks included and engaged, because folks who are living in sort of or more structured types of job roles, they'll need this structure in some form or another that could have been mimicked by being cubicle to cubicle that they were experiencing in that traditional office environment.
Mm-hmm. And do you think employers can play a role in mitigating that loneliness among remote workers? And what strategies have been successful in promoting social connectedness?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, and here's the deal. I think great companies, best-in-class companies, are always looking at increasing engagement, improving the employee experience, and making sure that everybody feels a sense of inclusion. And that wasn't just the pandemic that caused us to look at these things. Now, obviously, it kind of put us on a trajectory that made knowing how to manage in remote work or hybrid work environments important. But the thing is, there's always been a need to make sure that folks who weren't always as included in office settings were to be included. So folks who had different disabilities or maybe some non-traditional scheduling needs, they always needed to have a little bit of more effort put in than folks who can more ably get to the office setting in particular. Now, what are some things that those kind of companies can do to make sure that those folks are included? For one, we want to make sure that there is not a kind of special treatment given to people who are coming into the office versus those who aren't, or for those who are in the office only a few days a week. A few things can be done to make sure that this is done. So for instance, it could be that there should be some scheduling rules or best practices or even an etiquette guide that employees can share with managers and the kind of in the trenches employees as well. So for us here at Hubstaff, we are a fully remote company. And so we've got folks all across different time zones across the world. So one of the things that I like to do is ensure that meetings, especially team meetings, aren't set up in such a way that only folks in my time zone, I live in the East, closer to the Eastern sort of time zones in the United States. So I want to make sure that the folks in the United States aren't prioritized, whether intentionally or unintentionally, because having less face time, if you live in a different time zone, can actually cause the effect of, out of sight, out of mind, right? Mm-hmm. So that's that folks will need to keep in mind. Another thing that companies can do to ensure connection is making sure that they're not only emphasizing the need for company and organizational connectedness. So for instance, and I might be jumping ahead a little bit here, but I think one of the best companies that emphasizes connection over and against organizational connection is Atlassian, the company that makes software like Jira, for instance. Atlassian actually offers VTO, not PTO, but VTO. They call it volunteer time off. And what that means is employees actually get special time off to go volunteer Now, how can that combat loneliness? Well, here's how. When you're volunteering, you're very likely getting connected with other folks in real life. And what's great about that is not only you're connecting with folks in real life, but you're contributing to a vision and mission. There's nothing that helps you feel more engaged by contributing to something bigger than you, especially in nonprofit settings, especially for volunteer opportunities. Now, what's great about Atlassian, which is also sort of a flexible work environment company, is that they make it clear that while it is important, of course, to connect with your coworkers, somebody who's connected through more than just their work, connected to their chosen communities, as it were, the people in their kind of immediate spheres outside of Atlassian in their case, that lends somebody to be more engaged when they are clocked in. Imagine if you can go to lunch with one of your best friends versus people you're forced to sit with. And I say that in a cheek way. You'll come back to the office after your lunch break feeling reinvigorated and encouraged after getting a sandwich or a salad with your best friend. So yeah, there are several things that companies can do to encourage that connectedness.
And technology has contributed to that as well, right? With remote work and work from home, we have been having meetings over these platforms like Zoom, Google Meet, and whatnot, right? So do you think this can help remote workers combat loneliness and foster a sense of belonging in virtual teams?
Absolutely. And there are a few different levels, I think. So one is the kind of on-the-ground tactile communication. So Hubstaff, we use Slack as our primary communication channel. And like I mentioned before, we have a few etiquette guides about this. So for one, we make sure that we're taking an async first approach, an asynchronous first approach. Well, what does that mean? Well, that means that our first reaction to some new information or to a project should not necessarily be trying to get a meeting on the calendar first. Why is that? Well, meetings can be kind of expensive in terms of the time it takes to get everybody in a room, and they're not always effective. Now, here's another part for why meetings shouldn't be a first choice. That goes back to something I said before. People are on different time zones in different parts of the world. When you start off with a synchronous first approach, that can sort of penalize people in different time zones, and it can penalize people who are trying to protect their work-life balance. So if someone in a different time zone from you is saying, let's get a meeting on the calendar, and that meeting is for 9 p.m. or 4 o'clock in the morning, you might feel the need to perform at your highest by getting up really, really early or not spending time with your family to make those meetings. So when we do an async first approach to our kind of communication etiquette, it saves us time and money from having to get into a meeting that maybe not everybody needed to be on. And it also allows us to not penalize people working in different time zones. So that's the on-the-ground sort of communication style. There's another element that technology can help out with in terms of keeping people engaged. I like to call that the sort of rewards and recognition side of HR. There are lots of technology platforms that can do this. So several technology platforms that can actually work alongside some other very important kind of branding and marketing needs. There are several great platforms that allow people to kind of hook up their own social media accounts to corporate social media accounts. So when, for instance, the company is trying to share information about a new piece of research going out, employees can share that same messaging across their own personal profiles and collect points. Now they can actually compete against one another with those points, kind of like fantasy football or things like that, and be rewarded if they kind of win in terms of the most shares or most engagement on those shares and get a free t-shirt or a company water bottle or a Starbucks gift card or things like that. Now, what's great about that is that it kind of lends people to have the kind of camaraderie that the competition provides, and it allows people to feel like they're a part of something bigger than themselves and promoting some company news or things like that. I think there's one more element to that as well. One of the things that one can do in a company is promote non-work communication. So at Hubstaff, we have several Slack channels that have almost nothing to do with work. We have a food Slack channel where people share the fun meals that they've made. There's a random channel where people talk about video games or new TV shows that they've watched. And folks are encouraged to participate in those channels. So it isn't just all work and no play. We should be able to find friends in our workplace, not merely coworkers. And technology can help with that.
Exactly. And last but not the least, what steps can individuals take to proactively combat loneliness while working remotely? And what resources are available to support them?
I think that's a great question. So, I mean, look, here's the thing. In the US, the Surgeon General basically said that there's a public health crisis of loneliness. And actually, the negative effects, health effects of loneliness are about the equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So it's a big deal. So obviously, in the same way that one would want to take sort of a preventative healthcare approach to preventing loneliness, one should be on the lookout, whether you're a manager or an HR or people ops professional, on how to maintain healthiness and workplace wellness. So there's a few things that can be done. For one, creating policies around when and how long folks should be working is super important. So at Hubstaff, we're capped at working 40 hours a week. We don't put in overtime and we don't want to. We are actually encouraging people by not being able to clock more time to go out and do things, hang out with friends, go on hikes. And if you go on a hike, post it on the outdoor adventures channels in the internal Slack thread. So that's one thing that can be done. Another thing that can be done is offering other incentives to get people out and about. So that VTO is a great opportunity. But there are also things like offering wellness reimbursements. So getting people to go out and go to the gym, and not just to get people out and moving, but to encourage them to be able to interact with others. Another very similar way of combining, reimbursements with productive work is offering reimbursements to co-working or office settings, or even offering people kind of a monthly gift card to their local coffee shop to get them out and connected and potentially connected with people working in similar spaces as them. Often there are actually local communities, and I actually run one in my local town, for getting remote and hybrid workers connected. And the goal is to have more than just the connection of, hey, if you're working between 9 to 5, come work at this co-working spot or a coffee shop together. It also provides a sense of community for non-work activities. So if you're looking for someone to catch a movie with or to go to karaoke night with, you can easily get involved in one of these remote or hybrid worker local communities to have that to recreate that water cooler experience for people that work in totally different companies than you, but who are also working remotely and are looking for that sense of connection. Another thing that I might recommend for companies to do as they're trying to improve employee engagement and fight against loneliness and encourage that workplace wellness is to have affinity groups. So it's one thing to have a great sort of public channel on Slack talking about food or outdoor adventures, but it's another thing to make sure that people are actively engaged in wanting to contribute to those types of things. So a work group or a center of excellence or an affinity group could be based around particular types of communities. So you might have a sports fan kind of employee research group. You might have a group for minorities to talk about their needs and DEI efforts. You might also have sort of an employee group for focusing on different trends in the workplace. I've seen several centers of excellence or resource groups focused on things like productivity or agile project management. So people who are interested in improving their craft at getting more things done more efficiently are not only improving their internal work, but they're also connecting with their coworkers that have similar interests as well. So providing sort of an exponential increase in engagement and also in workplace productivity. And of course, not forgetting improving workplace wellness by keeping people connected and not socially isolated.
Yes, exactly. Like you mentioned, workplace wellness is very important. And these days we have several wellness platforms, right? For these remote workers, these platforms can bring all the workers together on a common platform and give them wellness tasks, right? So I believe that is very important. And with each day, all the companies are prioritizing employee health and they are working towards it. Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so with this, we are at the end of the session. So thank you so much, William, for sharing your valuable insights with us. It was great talking to you. I hope you enjoyed this session as well.
Absolutely. Thanks so much again for having me on. I love talking about this topic and helping people maintain workplace wellness.
Thank you so much. Have a great day ahead.
Awesome. Thanks. You too.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Bye now.
Thanks for listening to Vantage Fit Corporate Wellness Podcast. Please do subscribe to Vantage Fit Corporate Wellness Podcast on Apple Podcast, Spotify, and our YouTube channel for new episodes.